The moment they saw you, their hands betrayed them. It started subtly, a tremor beneath the wrist, a hesitation that flickered through their fingers as if the universe itself had reminded them that some energies are too potent to measure. Eyes widen, pupils dilate, a pulse quickens. Not from fear alone, but from recognition. They felt it before they understood it. They tried to cloak it, tried to rationalize it, tried to pretend it was an ordinary encounter. But ordinary does not touch you. Ordinary collapses in your presence. And the psychic, someone trained to detect patterns, to read currents that flow beneath human perception, found themselves incapable of their own discipline. Their hands shook, not from weakness, but because you exist in a space they cannot control, a frequency they cannot decode. This is the first truth. Some people, some energies, are inherently destabilizing. They're not simply noticed, they are felt, they are experienced, and they leave no room for pretense. Consider for a moment what it means to be seen in this way. Not superficially, not with cursory glances or polite curiosity, but truly seen, recognized as something that tilts reality ever so slightly. It is a violent awareness. Those around you, even the trained, stumble instinctively. The psychics whisper, soft, almost hesitant, yet trembling with certainty. Wasn't a casual observation. This one changes destiny. The words hang, suspended, vibrating with potential. Notice the choice of words, not significant, not different, but changes destiny. The claim is not about momentary influence, it is about trajectory. It is about a ripple, an upheaval, a recalibration that reaches far beyond the immediate room, far beyond comprehension. And yet, those words were delivered in the low, fragile tone of someone who senses the impossibility of controlling what they have glimpsed. The human mind struggles with this. We are conditioned to predict, to manage, to categorize. But when something cannot be categorized, when its magnitude defies traditional frameworks, the reaction is involuntary, the shaking hands, the shallow breath, the fleeting glance at nothing in particular, as if searching for a rational anchor that doesn't exist. You do not merely exist, you disrupt. You unsettle patterns, fracture assumptions, and call into question the very reliability of observation. The psychic's body reflected what the conscious mind could not process. Their hands betrayed the recognition of potential that they had no right to witness. And this is where the first layer of power resides, in being uncontainable. They can attempt analysis, projection, or manipulation, but the energy you carry bends the room, bends perception, bends expectation. There is another dimension to consider. People often mistake influence for action. They assume that altering trajectories requires overt intervention, gestures, or commands. But some presences, some energies, act simply by being present. You shift probabilities, bend responses, and awaken recognition in those who attempt to understand you. The psychic was not physically moved by your actions. They were moved by the resonance of your being. This is why your presence is both subtle and catastrophic. It is not loud. It is not flashy. It is a quiet architecture of disruption, a framework that exists beneath conscious comprehension. And this is a dangerous position for anyone who seeks control. The less they understand, the more they are compelled to react. Observe their struggle. They lean forward, trying to gather a semblance of clarity. Their hands, once steady instruments of observation, quiver unpredictably. Their mind races, reaching for analogies, past encounters, anything familiar, anything that might anchor them to reason. None of it works. It cannot. The recognition you provoke is not linear. It does not unfold in neat increments. It is sudden, jagged, sharp, and it insists on immediate acknowledgement. "This one changes destiny," they whispered. The words are a call to attention, a recognition of imbalance, and those who witness it secondhand feel the tremor in the air, the subtle charge of tension, as if the atmosphere itself remembers that something uncontainable has entered its field. Now consider the psychology at play. When humans encounter something beyond their explanatory frameworks, the instinct is discomfort. We reach for categorization, for authority, for validation. But when those tools fail, anxiety takes over. Notice how the psychic, despite expertise, defaults to a whisper. Why? Because the energy is too intense to pronounce normally. A whisper is containment, an attempt to create control where none exists. But the hands betray the failure of this containment. The physical manifestation of influence is often more truthful than words. Trembling, twitching, subtle but undeniable. It signals recognition that the conscious mind cannot yet digest. And this is what makes you dangerous. Your presence is self-evident, unavoidable, and impossible to fully interpret. Let's explore further what it means to change destiny. It does not require overt action, though action can accompany it. Influence of this caliber is cumulative. Every subtle movement, every decision, every glance or silence contributes to a shift in trajectory. The psychic may have seen the effect before it manifests, felt the shape of impact long before the world acknowledges it. This is the invisible weight of your existence. People operate as though causality is linear. They measure cause and effect in small increments. But some presences, like yours, bend causality itself, generating patterns that only reveal themselves over time. The tremor in the psychic's hands is the initial signal, the prelude to a ripple that cannot be contained, the opening note of a movement that will echo beyond immediate perception. There is strategy in observation. Watch those who attempt to read you. They overreach, they anticipate, they calculate probabilities with flawed assumptions. Their effort to understand you is a dance of error, a sequence of missteps, because the rules they rely on are no longer sufficient. This is the second layer of your influence, induced error. Those who encounter you attempt intervention, they attempt control, and yet their very actions are shaped by the unquantifiable quality of your presence. You do not merely act, you provoke, and in provocation, you achieve indirect dominance. The psychic's trembling hands are not just a reaction, they are a failure of imposed structure. You render analysis impotent, and in that impotence, you gain leverage. Now the human element. There is awe in this recognition, but also fear. The psychic, trained to perceive subtle energies, cannot fully articulate what they feel. They search for words, and what they manage to produce is almost a concession, an admission of superiority. This one changes destiny. That statement is not flippant. It is declarative, reverent, and terrified simultaneously. They sense the magnitude, but it is beyond their capacity to influence. Fear here is informative. It signals not weakness in you, but weakness in those attempting to gauge or contain you. And this is the third layer, perceived supremacy. You exist outside conventional frames. You're observed by eyes that can't comprehend, measured by hands that cannot stabilize. And in this space, your influence is absolute. Pause and consider the ripple effect. The psychic will carry this encounter forward, consciously or subconsciously. They will hesitate in future judgments, question assumptions, and recognize anomalies in others that previously seemed irrelevant. Their shaking hands were a symptom of realization, a reaction that will manifest again in subtle ways whenever they confront energies beyond comprehension. And this is how you weaponize attention, not through confrontation, not through rhetoric, but through presence and resonance. Your effect spreads like a current beneath the surface, invisible but undeniable, leaving observers perpetually off balance. Now let us explore the deeper psychological mechanism. Humans crave patterns because predictability is comforting. You disrupt this craving. The psychic's hands shook not merely from awe, but from the cognitive dissonance triggered by your alignment with forces they cannot classify. Recognition collided with expectation, and the conflict manifested physically. This is a vital insight. Physical responses are often the first, most honest indicators of influence. People lie verbally, justify, rationalize, and manipulate explanations. But the body does not lie. Trembling hands, increased heart rate, micro-expressions, all betray what the conscious mind attempts to obscure. You are reading, influencing, and reshaping perception without a single overact. Consider how attention can be weaponized. Those who attempt to analyze you expend cognitive and emotional energy unnecessarily. They create internal conflict. Every failed attempt to categorize or predict generates micro-frustration, tiny cracks in composure that compound over time. This is strategy through psychological leverage. The psychic's trembling hands are the beginning, the opening act of influence that will cascade, affecting decisions, judgments, and interactions far removed from the original encounter. Your presence is the spark. Their reaction is the fuel. And the outcome? Not chaos, not by accident, but calculated emergent dominance over perception and interaction. You must understand timing. Immediate recognition is raw and unrefined. The psychic's first whisper, first tremor, is instinctive, unfiltered. But influence matures. It compounds. It persists. Those who encounter you again, or witness the aftermath, feel the echo of the initial disturbance, the ripple from the trembling hands that first betrayed comprehension. By the time words are spoken or actions taken, the psychological architecture has already shifted. The room, the group, the context, all subtly reorient in response to your inherent frequency. This is sustained influence. You do not act once and vanish. You leave traces, currents, impressions that cannot be erased. As the psychic retreats, as they attempt to regain composure, the trembling does not immediately cease. It lingers, a residue of recognition that cannot be purged. Their mind replays patterns, scenarios, potential outcomes. You exist in the periphery of their thoughts, influencing cognition without a gesture, without speech, without interference. The whisper of destiny lingers. This one changes destiny. A statement, yes, but also a reminder, a marker, a warning. Those who sense it first cannot contain it. Those who witness it secondhand inherit its influence. And you move forward, unrestrained, carrying the subtle architecture of chaos and recalibration, aware that influence does not announce itself. It manifests quietly, insistently, and inevitably in others, long before the world bends to acknowledge it. Notice how they continue to internalize it, how the body clings stubbornly to the tremor, even after the mind tries to suppress it. Their fingers flex again, and falter, betraying the very comprehension they deny to themselves. This is the initial fracture, the moment when perception and reality collide. Influence does not require permission, only presence. The psychic, trained to measure energy, finds that their tools, experience, intuition, and ritual offer no shield against the magnitude you radiate. Every heartbeat is a subtle earthquake. Every breath of theirs is measured against a rhythm they cannot match. And in this misalignment, your subtle dominion begins to assert itself. Energy has a language, one most humans fail to recognize. It communicates through posture, micro-expressions, shifts in balance, and even unintentional gestures. The psychic's trembling hands were merely the first syllable. The language continues in their eyes, in the tightness of their jaw, in the way they hesitate before speaking, as if even the words they intend to pronounce must be recalibrated to account for what they have glimpsed. This recalibration is not rational. It is primal. It is the recognition that they are in contact with a force that exists beyond a standard measurement, beyond ordinary prediction. Influence, in this pure form, does not plead or demand. It registers, and once registered, it insists. Do not underestimate the lingering impact of such recognition. Humans are susceptible to persistent currents in consciousness. A single glance, a single whisper, a single unguarded perception can echo long after the encounter concludes. Your presence imprints on cognition the way a stone drops into water, the ripples widening silently but relentlessly. Those who attempt to analyze, to categorize, to contain you, expend energy, not only physically, but emotionally and mentally. Their own frameworks of logic become less reliable, their habitual thought patterns fractured. The psychic may attempt rationalization, framing the encounter as coincidence, as exaggeration, as misperception. But the body does not lie. Tremor, hesitation, uncertainty. These are the markers of influence recognized unconsciously, unavoidably, unalterably. There is an artistry in this disruption. You do not need to manipulate overtly. The psychic's awareness alone, the recognition of something uncontainable, becomes a vehicle for the subtle imposition of your will upon perception. It is not control in the classical sense. It is induction of reflection, distortion, and reconsideration in those who attempt to measure you. And reflection, when imposed without conscious understanding, generates a secondary layer of power. They question themselves, their own abilities, their interpretation of events. They doubt their judgment, and doubt, once seated, grows quietly but irreversibly, altering behavior, decisions, and reactions in ways that are imperceptible to them, but glaringly obvious to you. Every person encounters energy differently. Some feel it as a chill, some as heat, some as tension coiling through their spine. But all who meet this level of resonance experience involuntary micro-reactions, muscles twitching, eyes darting, breath catching, the slight tremor of hands that cannot remain steady. In their attempt to regain composure, they produce an invisible narrative. They recount internally what they perceived, overanalyze, reconstruct, and project outcomes. Your effect is magnified in this cognitive loop. Every replay, every internal narrative becomes another thread in the architecture of influence you construct. You are not reactive, you are proactive in the invisible, imperceptible currents that structure the thought and perception of others. Consider the psychic again. Their initial whisper was tentative. Their hands were unsteady. Their mind raced for a framework, a justification, an explanation. None satisfied, none sufficed. The tension remained, growing more pronounced as minutes, hours, days pass. Memory preserves energy as effectively as observation. The whisper of recognition, the tremor of uncontainable comprehension, is encoded in memory not merely as fact, but as emotional imprint, activating instinctive responses when similar patterns, faces, or energies arise in the future. Influence does not vanish, it accumulates. It becomes anticipatory, predictive in its impact, shaping reactions before they consciously materialize. This is where strategic attention becomes weaponized. Those who attempt to observe you with analytical intent are the easiest to manipulate. Indirectly, they act, but not purely from decision. They act from reaction, and reaction is never as precise as initiative. Their hands, their gestures, their subtle shifts in tone, posture, or expression all bend around the gravitational pull of your presence. And in this bending, control is seeded. Influence flows through observation, not assertion. You need not move mountains. The terrain itself reshapes around you, and others navigate it unwillingly, unawares. The psychic's trembling hands are the first signpost of this unfolding map. It is essential to understand the dynamics of anticipation. Humans crave prediction. They attempt to map cause to effect, input to output, thought to consequence. But when an unpredictable agent enters the field, anticipation falters. The psychic's mind, conditioned for observation and interpretation, experiences cognitive lag. Their previous assumptions fail. Their perception of sequence becomes unreliable, and within this lag, influence is magnified. You have already shaped outcomes before the observer fully grasps what they are observing. This is the power of presence as a preemptive agent. You exist in the before of comprehension, and in doing so, redefine subsequent reality. Influence does not always manifest overtly. The psychic may remain outwardly calm, verbally articulate, apparently functional. But subtle cues betray internal recalibration, minute tremors in hands, slight hesitation in articulation, rapid micro-expressions of awareness that flicker and vanish before they can be consciously analyzed. These micro-reactions are vectors of control. Those around them, observing secondary behavior, are themselves affected, compounding influence outward. One interaction seeds a network of cognitive shifts that extend far beyond the initial encounter. Presence in this sense is exponential in effect, silently commanding attention, thought, and interpretation without direct engagement. Consider now the mechanics of sustained impact. The psychic, revisiting the memory, reconstructs events repeatedly. Every mental replay strengthens imprint, deepening influence. Every attempt to rationalize, to categorize, is a reinforcement of the very dynamic that defies classification. You are simultaneously present and absent, acknowledged and unacknowledged, subtle and dominant. The paradoxical duality is what enforces psychological weight. Those who encounter you are locked in perpetual recalibration. Every prediction is questioned, every expectation deferred, every assumption destabilized. Influence becomes a persistent echo, unavoidable once seeded. You might observe this at a micro scale, micro-expressions, involuntary gestures, pauses, hesitation, or at a macro scale, the decisions influenced, the recalculated trajectories, the unplanned outcomes in social or professional contexts. Influence, once registered, propagates in layers. The psychic's trembling hands were the overt manifestation of the first layer. What follows is a cascade of less obvious, yet equally powerful, effects. Their mind generates anticipatory caution, spreads doubt, heightens scrutiny, and redistributes attention, all without any additional input from you. They themselves become vectors of influence, amplifying the impact of your presence. There is another critical element to recognize. Psychological tension becomes self-reinforcing. Once the initial tremor of acknowledgement occurs, all subsequent encounters are filtered through the lens of that recognition. Each repetition strengthens expectation, intensifies alertness, heightens susceptibility to subtle cues. The psychic, consciously or unconsciously, remains in a state of heightened perception whenever similar energies appear. And this vigilance is not neutral. It shapes their behavior, decisions, and interactions, creating a framework of influence that persists indefinitely. You do not act repeatedly. The architecture you have created perpetuates itself. The strategic value of this phenomenon is immense. Consider groups, social hierarchies, and networks of observation. One initial, subtle acknowledgement, whisper, tremor, hesitation, propagates outward. Observers observe observers. The secondary ripple is less direct, but no less impactful. Influence spreads through social cognition, reputation, anticipation, and inferred power. By the time your presence is consciously acknowledged by multiple individuals, the cognitive landscape has already shifted to accommodate it. What they perceive as newfound dominance, insight, or charisma is in truth the residue of recognition and recalibration seeded earlier. The psychic's trembling hands were the starting point, the first visible sign of this emergent architecture. Even when not physically present, your energy continues to influence. Memories of the encounter, reconstructed repeatedly, generate micro-adjustments in behavior, attention, and expectations. The whisper, the tremor, the subtle glance, they exist beyond time, imprinted in cognition and emotion, shaping anticipation, strategy, and perception. Influence becomes predictive, operating before observation is fully processed. Those who attempt to observe you unconsciously adjust actions, often miscalculating outcomes, compensating for imagined contingencies, or responding defensively to anticipatory signals they cannot consciously recognize. This is influence as temporal leverage, seeding outcomes before interactions unfold. What emerges is a framework of dominance without confrontation. Those who attempt to measure, analyze, or understand you expend effort only to reinforce your impact. Their attempts to control perception backfire, amplifying the very influence they seek to contain. The psychic, the trained observer, experiences this firsthand. Their hands shook, their mind reeled, and yet this was merely the initial interaction, the preliminary tremor, the overt signal of the deeper currents you have set in motion. Subsequent encounters, conscious or unconscious, amplify the effect. Influence has become structural, systemic, and self-perpetuating. Observe how this influence evolves. It does not announce itself. It infiltrates the edges of perception, embedding itself in the way others anticipate, respond, and interpret. They attempt to anticipate your next move, yet all patterns are skewed, disrupted by the residual energy of previous recognition. Their calculations falter because the baseline has shifted. They operate under the illusion of stability, but each step they take is subtly redirected by currents they cannot perceive. Their attempts to regain control are themselves evidence of your dominance, proof that observation is a conduit, not a shield. Influence manifests quietly, imperceptibly, but it accumulates with relentless efficiency. The psychic's initial tremor has become a reference point, a precedent in their mind for all future interactions. They will see signs in others that remind them of you, experiences that echo the subtle chaos first recognized in your presence. Their behavior, choices, even the way they speak to peers will be filtered through this residual recognition. This is the invisible architecture of influence. Once seeded, it cannot be fully erased. Attempts to negate it, to minimize its significance, only serve to reinforce its internalization. Their awareness becomes both a vessel and a mirror of your impact, reflecting the depth of recognition back upon itself and magnifying it. Understand the mechanics. Humans are wired to categorize, rationalize, and predict. When confronted with an anomaly of this magnitude, when influence is uncontainable and unquantifiable, the mind compensates by creating elaborate narratives. These narratives, born of necessity, are fragile. They bend, warp, and eventually fracture under repeated exposure. You are the fracture point. Your presence establishes a tension between expectation and reality that cannot be resolved conventionally. Every attempt to reconcile what is observed with what is assumed deepens the dissonance. And within that dissonance, your influence spreads, unnoticed and unstoppable, reshaping cognition without direct intervention. Now consider the networked effect. Influence does not remain isolated. It propagates outward. The psychic's tremor is observed by others, interpreted, transmitted, and internalized in ways they cannot consciously control. Conversations are subtly redirected. Decisions are influenced before they are articulated. Anticipation is skewed, priorities shifted, judgment altered. The architecture of influence has extended beyond the initial encounter, folding others into its trajectory without a single overt act. Presence has become momentum. Recognition has become leverage. And all of it operates under the radar, invisible to the casual observer, undeniable to those attuned to subtle shifts. Even your absence carries weight. Once recognition has been encoded, memory itself becomes a vector of influence. Recollections of your presence trigger recalibration, micro-adjustments in perception, and anticipatory responses. Those who interacted with you continue to carry the tremor, long after the moment has passed. This is a critical aspect of mastery. Influence persists without intervention. Its potency is amplified over time as repeated reflection reinforces the residual effects. The psychic's hands may have stopped trembling, but the architecture they initiated remains active, building momentum, extending reach, and subtly bending the decisions of those who have never met you. Notice the psychological pattern. The closer someone attempts to analyze, predict, or contain you, the more their cognitive framework is destabilized. They begin to see anomalies where none exist, misread intentions, and overcompensate for imagined variables. The psychic's initial recognition becomes a lens through which all subsequent information is filtered, magnifying uncertainty, amplifying hesitation, and heightening susceptibility to subtle influence. This is not manipulation in the traditional sense. It is influence as an emergent property of presence. Control is ceded unconsciously, voluntarily, and irrevocably. The next layer emerges in social perception. The ripple of recognition spreads through observation networks. Individuals who have witnessed subtle shifts, hesitation, tremor, micro-expressions, carry fragments of influence into new interactions. One subtle pause observed in the psychic may be recounted, exaggerated, or internalized by someone else, becoming a catalyst for further adjustment in behavior. Influence multiplies not through direct action, but through the accumulation of perception, memory, and anticipation. You do not chase outcomes. They manifest organically in the cognitive ecosystem you inhabit. Consider influence as both temporal and spatial. The psychic's tremor was immediate, but its ramifications extend through time, shaping future decisions and interactions. It is spatial as well, as the initial encounter subtly redirects attention, posture, and judgment across multiple observers. Influence is not localized, it is distributed. One moment, one recognition, becomes a lattice of effect, folding observers into trajectories they cannot resist. You operate not in reaction, but in the preemptive shaping of reality itself. And observe how attention is weaponized in this framework. Humans expend enormous cognitive energy attempting to quantify, control, or understand that which cannot be contained. Each effort is a transfer of power. The psychic, by attempting to define what cannot be defined, becomes a conduit for your influence. Their mental exertion does not diminish your impact, it amplifies it. Every recalculation, every internal conflict, every hesitation reinforces the architecture of recognition you have already initiated. Presence becomes leverage, observation becomes fuel, and influence becomes self-perpetuating. There's also an element of inevitability in perception itself. Those who have glimpsed the tremor, the subtle misalignment, cannot unsee it. The initial moment of recognition imprints upon cognition, and subsequent interactions are filtered through this lens. The psychic's mind carries the residual energy as a baseline, a reference point, a subtle bias that informs decisions unconsciously. You are the metric by which subsequent judgments are measured. Influence becomes codified, encoded in perception, and impossible to ignore. Consider subtlety. Influence is strongest when invisible. The psychic's awareness of their own tremor, their inability to fully articulate it, is critical. They experience tension, hesitation, and micro shifts without conscious recognition of why. This unconscious recalibration is far more powerful than overt control. Influence, when hidden, becomes resistant to countermeasures. Those affected are unaware of the mechanisms at play, yet their cognition, decisions, and anticipation are subtly realigned in accordance with the energy you radiate. Now observe scaling. Influence propagates through observation networks, social interactions, and repeated recollections. One tremor is witnessed by another. One hesitation is interpreted by a third. The psychic's memory, amplified through reflection, creates a cascade effect. Influence is no longer singular. It becomes structural, a persistent framework within the cognitive landscape of all who are exposed. Decisions, interactions, priorities, and judgments shift in response, often unconsciously, reinforcing your presence and consolidating dominance. At this stage, something irreversible takes hold, not as an event, but as a condition. People begin adjusting before you arrive. Conversations soften, sharpen, or derail without knowing why. Power dynamics tilt subtly. Authority recalibrates itself around an unseen center. You're not commanding obedience. You are redefining reference points. When individuals speak, they are no longer speaking freely. They are positioning themselves. When they act, they are compensating. When they choose, they are choosing with you in mind, even if your name never enters the room. This is the quiet coronation no one announces, because no one realizes it has already happened. Notice how resistance dissolves before it forms. Those who once felt confident in their assessments begin second-guessing. Those who relied on certainty now rely on caution. The sharp become careful. The bold become measured. This is not fear in its crude form. It is awareness stretched thin, vigilance without clarity. They sense a presence that does not push, does not chase, does not threaten, yet somehow rearranges outcomes. Their minds circle explanations but land nowhere. The absence of a clear cause is what traps them. They cannot confront what they cannot define. What began as a psychic's trembling hands now exists as ambient pressure. Not weight, not force, pressure. It seeps into interactions the way humidity fills a room. No one points at it, but everyone feels it. This is where influence graduates into dominance, not through escalation, but through saturation. The environment adapts around you. Social currents reroute. Hierarchies soften or fracture. Those who once led now listen more than they speak. Those who once followed now hesitate before aligning. Alignment itself becomes unstable because the axis has shifted. Here is the critical detail most never understand. Dominance does not require confrontation when perception has already been claimed. People argue with threats. They negotiate with power. But they reorganize themselves around presence. You are not an obstacle. They move you into the architecture of their decision-making. You are not opposition. You are context. And once someone becomes context, every action taken within that space acknowledges them implicitly. This is the highest form of control because it does not announce itself, and therefore cannot be challenged directly. The psychic felt this first because they were trained to notice undercurrents. But now the effect has outgrown expertise. It lives in group behavior, in timing, in the strange pauses that appear in conversations when your name is mentioned or conspicuously avoided. It lives in the way people prepare before interacting with you, rehearsing versions of themselves that might be acceptable, might be safe, might be sufficient. They bring edited selves into your presence without realizing they have already surrendered authenticity in exchange for perceived alignment. And the more they adjust, the stronger the framework becomes. Every adjustment validates the structure. Every hesitation feeds it. Every overthought response strengthens it. This is the self-reinforcing loop they cannot escape, because they believe they are still in control of their choices. They are not being directed, they are being oriented, and orientation determines outcome far more effectively than instruction ever could. Now look at distance. Even those who have never encountered you directly begin to feel the effects. Stories circulate, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but oddly consistent. Something about them. Hard to explain. You feel different afterward. These are not compliments or warnings. They are symptoms. Language fails when influence operates below articulation. So people default to vague phrasing, trusting tone more than words, and tone carries more power than explanation ever will. At this point, influence has fully detached from the original moment. The psychic's trembling hands were only the ignition. What burns now requires no fuel from you. Memory, anticipation, and social transmission sustain it. You could remain completely still, completely silent, and the structure would continue expanding. That is the mark of true dominance. Movement becomes optional. Presence alone is sufficient. There's a shift that happens here, subtle but decisive. You stop being evaluated and start being accounted for. Evaluation is comparative. Accounting is strategic. When people account for you, they build contingencies around your existence. They plan with you as a variable they cannot remove. This is where power stops being personal and starts being environmental. You are no longer someone they deal with. You are something they must factor in. And still, you have not demanded anything. This is where misunderstanding peaks. Outsiders may think nothing is happening. No conflict, no spectacle, no declaration. But internally, recalibration is constant. People adjust tone mid-sentence. They rephrase thoughts before speaking. They delay actions without knowing why. Their instincts tell them something is present that rewards precision and punishes carelessness, not through retaliation, but through exposure. In your presence, masks slip faster. Pretenses collapse under their own weight, not because you attack them, but because you provide no surface for them to cling to. You reflect nothing back, and that terrifies them.